Day 4 of Ontario's new emergency brake shutdown, which includes restrictions on in-person shopping and limits on outdoor gathering and the closure of personal care services and gyms and restaurants and a ban on indoor public events. But the rising numbers of COVID-19 cases have some health experts concerned that these measures are not enough. Today, the province reported 3,065 new cases of COVID-19, with Ottawa making up 176 of them. Yesterday, Dr. Vera Etches was among 3 top doctors urging the province to implement a stay-at-home order in addition to the current shutdown, although as we talked about in the last half hour, that does not include schools. For more, I'm joined by Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist and associate professor at the University of Ottawa. Hello again.
Hello.
So when you hear those numbers, what does that tell you about how bad the situation is in Ottawa right now?
It's pretty bad. I mean, province-wide, this is the worst it's probably ever going to be. Well, worse it's been. This third wave is going to be the worst wave of what I'm trying to say. And I don't think people fully understand that. They don't feel it in their bones yet, but all the signs are there that we're looking at an exploding number of cases very soon.
Those variants, I mean, we were talking a little bit about the situation in BC earlier in the program. How much of a risk do you think they pose in Ottawa?
Well, the P1 variant, the Brazilian variant so-called, is not quite as prevalent here yet, but it will be here eventually if we don't control things. Right now we're dealing with B117, the so-called UK variant, and we have significant presence of B135, the South Africa variant. Those are bad enough. P1 would prove a significant confounder to our efforts, so that would be a bit of a nightmare scenario. But I don't think we're quite there yet. We can control things from spreading from BC to here if we work as a country, with the principles of containment applied uniformly, and I have faith that we can do those things.
I'll come back to that. I mean, because at this point, I think so many people are so confused about what to make of these recent emergency brake measures, and there have been different lockdown measures and terminology that have described them throughout the pandemic. What do you think of the restrictions that were announced on Thursday?
They are tepid. They're tepid and insufficient. I mean, they come down to essentially gray zone plus no indoor, no restaurant dining. So insufficient numbers of restrictions have been put into place to really quell the spread, in my opinion. And if you live in Toronto or Peel, there aren't a whole lot of changes that you're going to experience. What we need, as Dr. Etches and Dr. Lowe and Dr. Villa have recommended, is a stay-at-home order, and I would add to that a school closure order as well. So this is a dire scenario, and the harder we act and the sooner we act, the faster we can get out of it. And this would and should be the final great restriction that we suffer in this pandemic, such that we get enough time to vaccinate enough arms and get out of this once and for all. But we have to buy time to get enough vaccines in our arms, and that means slowing transmission as much as we can by shutting things down.
So what kinds of things? What would you need to see in terms of measures that would make sense at this point in the pandemic?
I think we need a stay-at-home order for all non-essential businesses, and we need to support those people who are economically affected. Absolutely, we need to do that. And for those workers who must go to work to sustain civilization, I think we have to make sure that they have childcare opportunities. I think school closures has to be considered now. It's quite dire, and I feel pretty strongly about that, except, again, for children of essential workers, and for vulnerable kids who can't handle being at home right now. We need vaccinations for essential workers. So redeploy our vaccine strategy to make sure those people keeping society running are protected because they're not given the tools to protect themselves. We need paid sick days, of course, because we don't want to incentivize these essential workers making their co-workers sick. And we need rapid tests for essential workers to, again, sustain those workplaces while we work through this emergency. The current scenario, frankly, is insufficient to quell the crisis, in my view.
Why? I mean, what about it is insufficient?
Well, if you look at what Toronto and Peel were experiencing the last few weeks and months, they were essentially experiencing this. The current scenario with, minus restaurants being open. And they were unable to get out of that crisis scenario. Now, what we're looking at here is more tepid restrictions that we saw the last couple times around, and yet the virus is more transmissible. So we have a more dire threat, but a less intense response. That makes no sense. If you look at Ottawa's wastewater signal, which I just did seconds ago, it's terrifying. It's the highest it's ever been since we started measuring this. We're about to see the worst of this pandemic. And we have, in response to that, the weakest of public policy responses yet. And what we learned back from the Christmas restrictions and the October restrictions were that we have to act early and act hard, because when we don't, things get too bad too fast. That's one lesson has percolated throughout the world in every jurisdiction that has done this well. Act early, act hard, so you don't have to act long.
I mean, you heard Dr. David Williams, Ontario's chief medical officer, saying that this call for a stay-at-home order is being reviewed along with other recommendations, but it's going to take a while to enforce. It could take a while to enforce because of due process in government structures. And some are saying, okay, then you have to do a targeted approach. It's the better option at this point.
Well, the targeted approach, I mean, by certain regions, I think you can start there, but then look at the provincial strategy. Look, right now, if you fly in from New Zealand, which has almost no cases, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks and have a negative test. But you can drive from a hot zone in Toronto to a small town and enjoy indoor dining. You know, that makes no sense. We're allowed to spread infection domestically, but not internationally. So long as we don't have domestic restrictions, these regional approaches are going to fail. So if that is the path we're going to go, it has to come with some significant domestic travel restrictions. I don't see that happening to any great extent. I don't know why it would take long to implement stay-at-home order, considering we've done it before. So the policies are there, the levers are there. Strikes me the political will is not there. But we have to do something. We have to act fast. What we saw this past weekend in terms of human interaction and socialization, that won't manifest in the data for another week or two, and it's going to be huge. So brace yourselves. I hope I'm wrong, but I think we're about to see some staggering numbers.
What about schools? I mean, we were just talking to teachers in the last half hour. A lot of parents are concerned about sending their kids to school. We've seen regions, Toronto, Peel, Guelph, already moved back to virtual learning. Dr. Etches has said she doesn't think schools need to close in Ottawa, that a stay-at-home order would make it easier for them to stay open. I think a lot of people are struggling to understand this whole idea of risk in schools. If the idea is we're seeing these very high numbers elsewhere and people are this seems to be spreading, and the concern of that is going to be brought into the schools.
Yeah, schools are confusing, and even the experts can't agree. So there are those who feel that schools are not significant pandemic accelerators and those who feel that they are. And I'm of the latter category. I think that they are. And here's why. Testing and contact tracing are not set up to answer the question of whether or not schools are pandemic accelerators. So you can look at that and say, hey, there's no strong signal of acceleration, therefore schools are safe. But we can look at indirect evidence to get a broader picture. So there are 10 school outbreaks in the last week in Ottawa, bringing the total number of outbreaks, I think, to 23 in March alone. York Region closed schools because insufficient number of teaching staff were able to keep schools open. Why were there insufficient staff? Because they were sick. Across Ontario, overall incidence is increasing about 1 or 2 weeks after school openings. We have in Toronto, the incidence rate in schools is higher than the incidence rate in under 20s who aren't in school, suggesting that schools are transmitting faster. And internationally, Scotland saw incidence rates in the community double after schools reopened. So to me, there are sufficient indirect signals to suggest that schools, at the very least, are not just reflecting community transmission, but are causing additional infections within the schools and back into their families. Now, all that is hand-waving arguments, so we can debate the numbers back and forth. But if we're serious about clamping down on this particular wave as quickly as we can, to get us out of the crisis as quickly as we can, then we close everything now and support those who need support. Let's make that clear, because people are going to suffer, and we have to keep our eyes open to that and make sure that we're generous with our help for those people.
You're saying close everything, including schools?
I think so, yeah. And you know what? We probably would not have had to have done so had we not reopened non-essential businesses so early, and had we paid high-risk businesses to stay closed, or subsidized, the appropriate businesses in the right way. So if we're going to keep schools open, as we said we wanted to, we failed to make the schools safe by keeping class sizes large and by not vaccinating teachers, and things like that. Now, if we're going to close schools, the parents have to be given advance warning as well, and supports for how to deal with their kids being at home. School closures don't work unless there's a stay-at-home order. Let's be clear about that, because then who's going to take care of the kids? So all this goes hand in hand. But my position is, we've got to close everything now, because we're looking at the phrase tsunami of cases is overused and people are sick of hearing it. But we're looking at a very large number of cases. And I think it's in our best interest to just slow things down. See, previously the lockdowns were criticized because they were seen as being interminable. We can't live like this forever. And it's true, we can't live like this forever. But now an exit strategy is in sight. Vaccination is our way out. Give us time to vaccinate enough people so that we can open things up once and for all and keep them open.
Just one last question. I mean, when we keep coming back to that, I keep hearing the same quote from all sources. Show me the evidence. Show me the evidence that there was transmission because of restaurants. Show me evidence about schools. Show me evidence. And when you're saying that the scientific experts disagree on schools, just as one example, what is the evidence that is being relied on when it comes to where things are spreading, where the actual location for how things spread? I think there are people still struggling to understand that.
Well, if you look at for schools, for example, how many cases are occurring in schools, that's the easiest metric. And maybe you'll say, hey, there isn't a lot of cases in schools relative to these places, or maybe 99% of schools haven't had a case in the past couple of weeks, something like that. But 1%, by the way, is a large number, as one of my colleagues computed. But we look at the failure of the other things not being mentioned. For example, if an asymptomatic child infects his or her family, you don't discover that outbreak until the adult in the family is tested because they're symptomatic. And the contact tracing isn't set up to identify the child as the index case. Right. So that scenario is never identified as a case of school accelerating in the community. It's identified as a case of the adult giving it to the child, which is not what happened. So our system is not set up to identify that scenario. We need, better asymptomatic surveillance, and we need deeper contact tracing, for which we do not yet have the resources to do so. So that's why I'm frustrated when I hear the constant banshee cry of schools are safe and there's no transmission. We really don't know. That's why we look at these indirect measures of comparing incidence rates versus the community incidence rate and so forth.
Very well. We'll hold it there. Thanks very much again for your time today.
Thank you.
That's Raywat Deonandan, epidemiologist, associate professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Ottawa.